Welcome to the third part of the session of administering virtual networks. In this part of the session, we'll start looking at Azure DNS. So let's get started. Now, when you're managing DNS in Azure environment, there are different areas that we can work with. Let's start looking at one of the first areas, which is to do with DNS for your Entra ID. Now, for DNS, typically it's a service that we use for naming our resources. So domain name service or system that we can use in our environment to map different naming conventions to our resources. Typically in the web world, all the locations in different parts of the world are based on IP addresses. However, for us to remember these details, we typically know them by a name, something like learn.microsoft.com. However, in the backend, there must be an IP address that it links to. Now, in this scenario, we're talking about using a domain name service for our Entra ID. Now, from module number 1, when we spoke a little bit more about our identity services, we spoke about how we can go and create a tenant. And as a result of creating a tenant, by default, your tenant setting requires you to create a domain name. That domain name typically gets registered by default in your environment. Now, this domain name by default looks a little bit like what you have on the screen. So you will see details like on Microsoft.com added at the end of the domain that you choose. So for instance, in our scenario, when we registered Contoso, we could have seen a domain name called Contoso, and as a default setup, it will simply say contoso.onmicrosoft.com. Now, if you don't want to carry on using the default domain details on your environment, what you can do in your Entra environment, look for adding a custom domain. Now, for the custom domain, one thing that's important to bear in mind that you should be able to go and purchase a domain name from a registrar somewhere and then bring that domain name into Azure environment. In Azure, we can look at purchasing domain names under App Services and under M365. However, you can't purchase a domain directly under Entra ID. So for that part, you can go into a registrar such as GoDaddy.com or something similar and purchase a domain name like contoso.com or whatever company name that you prefer choosing for your environment. Once you have that detail available to hand, all you can do is go into Entra, look at registering a custom domain name to your Entra. Let's have a look at some of these details in the portal. Now we're back in the portal, and for this part of the session, we're going back one more time into Entra ID, which we covered in module 1. And you saw a similar setup that we spoke about as my demo environment looks like at the moment. The name for my demo setup has Contoso registered. However, my primary domain is slightly different. Now they can be similar, as I mentioned in module 1. However, if the name is already taken, you might need to end up choosing a different name. But the default setting, as we see in the back of the domain name that we choose, the primary domain will always finish on Microsoft.com. Now, if you don't want the user accounts and other details that you're creating within your Entra environment to finish on .onmicrosoft.com and you want to bring your own domain name, you need to go and purchase one from a registrar. However, once you've purchased the domain, all you need to do is scroll down to the blade within your Entra environment and look for custom domain names. Now, in Microsoft Entra ID, you can see the primary domain that's already registered and available and verified for you. This is the current primary setting that we have. However, if I'm bringing the other domain details, like for instance, contoso.com, let's go and see how we can add that. Now, given that I've purchased one already, all I'm doing is just making an entry of that in this environment. So all I'll do is simply over here, go and type in contoso.com and hit on add. Now, when I hit the add button, what this setup does is takes me to another page. Before I can use these details in my environment, I am required to take one of these 2 records that are available to me at this point either taking my text record or TXT records or Microsoft Exchange or MX record and create an entry under my registrar, under the DNS settings of my registrar, and make an entry for one of these resources. Now, the details will typically be available for you to pick from over here. So you copy these details and make an entry in the registrar. Now, currently we're looking at a TXT example. We can switch this to MX record and choose either MX or TXT record. Now, the important part is that you will need to make sure that you take one of these records, or if you want both, you can take one of these records and make an entry into your registrar. And once you have done that, after completing some of that, you will be able to then come in the bottom of the screen and hit the verify button. Now, like it says over here as well, that it will not work until you've made an entry in your registrar with that particular detail that's mentioned on the screen up here. So it's very, very important that we copy these details out exactly as they are and create an entry under the registrar. So as the traffic flows and somebody types in contoso.com or a resource that ends on at contoso.com, that goes to my registrar wherever I have registered my detail on the domain. Looking at these records that we've created, it'll point this information into Azure on some of the details that are listed for me in this environment. Now, again, I won't be able to hit verify as yet because I don't have a registrar where I've registered contoso.com. However, if you did, then you'll be able to complete the setup by hitting verify. Now, if I refresh this, typically this will change from unverified to be available. And once this is verified and available for me to use, I can switch this to be my primary detail or domain detail in my environment. Once I do this, I should be able to go and create my user account or change my existing users based on some of those details. Now, in module 1, we had a look at how to create user accounts in my setup. All I can do is simply go and look at creating either a new user or an existing user and change the settings for them and switch them around for a new domain detail that will pop under the screen here. Now, if I set that as a primary domain, then that will be the first detail that will appear here by default, and I can see this as a secondary option for me to pick from. So again, some of those details that you might need to consider when you're working with your Entra in creating your DNS. Now, that's the first part of my DNS in Azure environments. Can I use DNS for other services or other resources? Yes, we can. Now, there are a couple of other settings for DNS that we can jump into talking about. So let's go back into the portal and have a quick look at configuring DNS for my resources. Now, in this part of the session, we'll talk a little bit around how I can associate DNS to my existing resources that I might need to resolve over the internet. For example, if a user is trying to access a resource like a virtual machine over the internet, and they need to type in my address for that virtual machine, instead of me providing them a public IP address for that virtual machine, I could simply give them a name, like webserver@contoso.com or webserver.contoso.com, and they can land onto my virtual machine. Now, this can only be possible if I have a DNS setting that allows or caters for that. Now, let's have a quick look at some of these details in my portal environment. The first thing that we'll need to do over here is type in DNS zones. This is where we can create a DNS zone where we can create an entry for a resource that we're trying to link to a DNS that we have. Now, I'll go and start creating a DNS entry. Now, again, we'll go through some basic setups over here using my subscription, choosing my resource groups that I want to work with today, and creating a DNS entry over here. Now, one thing that's important to understand that you must already have a DNS detail or DNS name, or in fact, a domain name that you have purchased from a registrar before you start doing this process. Now, contoso.com is already a reserved service, so I can't use this in this demo. However, we can try something like contoso.net just for this part of the demo. Now, again, I must have purchased this domain or domain details from a registrar for me to continue with the rest of the process. In this case, we don't have one, but we'll see how this looks like and what we can do in terms of working around on how typically it should look like once you've continued with the process. Now, I'll keep the rest of the details as same, and let's jump into it. Now, if you're looking to edit any of your DNS settings or DNS zone settings in an editor mode, by all means, you can do that in here. For this part of the session, we'll leave this out and we'll simply hit create and review to just see what we're requesting for the setup to do. So we're creating a DNS zone called contoso.net and we'll hit create. Now, once this is created, we should simply see some details around my DNS that is ready to use. However, let's go into the DNS settings straight away. Now, this is my DNS zone that's ready for me to work with. If I look at the top of the navigation, I can see this is currently looking at contoso.net, which is my DNS zone. Again, in the overview tab, I can see some details that's providing me over here. The important part here would be that I must copy out the 4 named server records or NS records from in here and take them to my registrar where I have my domain name registered and place all 4 of these in there. So you have to copy all 4, even though some details here you might not see or you might not have. However, it's important you copy all 4 of these and place them into the registrar where you've created your or purchased your domain name from. Now, after doing that, we can come back into this DNS zone and we can start looking at the record sets that it has. And by default, it has the NS record that is created, the ones that we would have copied out and pasted in our registrar. Apart from that, it has start of service over here already available for me to look at. Now, apart from these, there's no other record available. Now, this is where we will have to start creating a record for our resources. So as and when somebody types in an address, it is then redirected to a resource that sits in the backend. Now here we can allocate resources. Let's assume we call it web server 1, or we can just leave it as web server, and we'll look at the link a bit like webserver.contoso.net. That will be my address to reach out to this resource. Now, you have different types of records that you can create as DNS, but in this part of the session, we'll stick to A records that are used for IPv version 4. Now, if you're looking at IPv version 6, then you might be looking at quadruple A records, but for now, let's carry on with IPv version 4. So we have IP version 4, and what we are going to do is we're going to add in the IP address of the resource. Now, just for this demo, we'll just type in an IP address .1.2.3.4. In real scenarios, you'll type in the IP address of the resource where this domain name will resolve into. So my web server.contoso.net should resolve into. And we'll simply hit add, and this is where it will create me a new record for that resource right over here. Now, just to show you how you typically test this is a bit like this. So I am simply going to run my PowerShell as we saw in module number 3, that we can start our Cloud Shell environment and host PowerShell. Let's try running some commands in here just to test how things would look like. Let's switch this to PowerShell. Now my PowerShell is up and running. So what we can do is we can try a quick command in here to run and see if it will show me the records. Now for this part of the session, we'll run a NS lookup as an operator to see if we can look up the records that it has. Now for it to do this, what we will need is to type in the web that we are trying to reach, which our case was a web server.contoso.net. Now, typically, if I was typing this in correctly, I would be able to resolve this straight away. However, because I don't have that domain name contoso.net, and I haven't gone and created the NS records in the backend for these, so what I will need to do is I'll need to bring in the NS record to kind of provide it with some details in here to suggest, hey, you're looking for that record for the webserver.contoso.net in NS1, the details that I've copied from the setup. In the real scenario, this redirection happens automatically from when the resource goes to contoso.net, looks for that entry for NS records, and then points at my Azure resources. So if I was to hit enter, now this is where it comes back with the details on the records that we've created in our environment. As you can see, it will look into resolving that name that we have created in backend called webserver.contoso.net into the IP address of the resource that we added as part of a record, which in my scenario is 1.2.3.4. Again, hopefully this will be a real IP address of your resource that you're working with in the backend. And this is where you can create multiple entries of your resources. But again, one thing that's important to understand, that for you to work with DNS zones, you will still need to purchase a domain name and add the details of NS records in this scenario for your DNS zones to work. Now, for the last part of your DNS, we're going to look at managing resources that are within your environment that you might want to link to your services, but you don't necessarily want this traffic to be resolved over the internet. However, I still want my existing resources to talk to each other. For instance, I want a single virtual machine to be able to speak to another virtual machine. I could connect from one resource to another. However, in this case, instead of using the private IP address of that resource, I might want to type in the name of that resource and reach that destination. Now, one thing that's very important to understand, we will create a private DNS zone in this scenario. The private DNS zones are not resolved over the internet, unlike other DNS zones that we were talking about earlier on. They are resolved over the internet. These are resolved locally within the resources that you're working within Azure environment. Now let's have a look at this in the demo on the portal on how we do this. Now I am back onto my portal. What we are going to try typing in here is private DNS zones, and we can create one. Now let's start creating a private DNS zone. Let's hit create. As usual, some basic details for creating my resource. My subscription is in place, my resource group is chosen, and I get to choose the name of my private DNS zone. Now again, we can call it whatever we like, because this is going to be kept within my setup and it's not actually going over the internet to resolve, so I can choose any names that I like. For instance, let's try fabricam.com, or in fact we can use fabricam.net, whatever you fancy or whatever your needs are for this scenario. And we'll move on from there. Now again, for my DNS in this scenario, we have a private DNS zone editor. We're not going to edit some of these details in this part of the session. We'll move on from here. Now, one important thing to remember for private DNS zone is this. We are not going to be adding any entries in any registrar, because we're not necessarily looking for this traffic to be resolved over the internet. So we don't need to purchase a domain name for this particular part of the session to work. So if you are linking your resources internally and you want to connect to them using a naming convention, in this case, the private DNS zone would do that for me. However, for a virtual network to understand that it can use a private DNS zone or is available or linked to it, we need to link a virtual network to that DNS zone. Now we can do that right now, or we can do that at a later stage. We can add multiple different virtual networks to a single DNS zone for them to work, and that should not be a problem. So let's go ahead and add one virtual network for now, and we'll try to see if we can do one later on. So all I'm going to do is click on add a virtual network. We'll give it a name to this. Let's say VNet to DNS link. So that's the name I'm choosing for this particular link that we're creating. However, in the real scenario, please make sure your name that you use is something that reminds you of what this link is for which network and why you're creating this. Again, if you have too many of them, it might be easier for you to look at the name and understand what this link associates to. Again, choosing this under my subscription, and the virtual network that we are going to try link today we're going to pick one of them up from here. Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to choose a virtual network that I have called VNet A. So we'll work with VNet A as part of this setup. Now, as you can see, as soon as I choose a virtual network under configuration, I have a feature here that suggests, do you want to auto register or enable auto registration? Now, this is a very, very good feature. Let's assume in my virtual network, I have a few subnets in here, and each subnet then has a few virtual machines running inside of this environment, and I might need to register them. As a manual process, I will need to go and create manual entries. So the resources that I want to resolve by using naming convention, I'll need to make that many number of entries in my DNS records here. If I don't, then those resources won't have a naming convention to resolve onto. So as I've drawn around 8 boxes, 8 virtual machines, for example, if I don't want to go and do this manually, I can simply tick this box and say auto register, and it will automatically create me DNS records or a record in my DNS automatically for these virtual machines, and allow me to start working with those naming conventions. One thing to bear in mind, by default, what it will do is it will pick up your existing name for that resource and use that to work with your DNS entry. For instance, if you created your virtual machine and you named it VM1, then in this case, it will automatically start linking it as vm1.fabricam.net. Now, if you wanted to call that VM1 as app server or a web server or something else, in that case, you might want to go and edit that or create a manual entry for that resource itself. One more thing that's important to understand, we spoke about limits and quotas for your subscription. Again, one more limit that we can point out here, you can use up to 100 virtual networks in this scenario to have auto registration. However, your private DNS zones can cater for many more virtual networks to be added onto the setup. However, only up to 100 can be added in here as auto registration. So bear that in mind. Now, I'll leave the auto registration part out because I want to show you how to create a manual record in case, and we can click on that and we'll show you the auto registration for another VNet. So let's go ahead and leave that setting out and hit create. Now, I've linked the virtual network to this DNS zone. Now that means the resources that live inside of that virtual network can use this private DNS zone, and as and when I create the records for it, they will be able to resolve on naming convention and allow you to connect from one resource to another. So let's hit create and let's wait for this to complete. Currently, it has no records. We can create them in a few moments. All right. The private DNS zone is now completed. So let's go into it and have a look at it. Now, as we can see, I have a private DNS zone ready. It suggests I have one virtual network added. This is something that we chose as part of our setup. So we added one virtual network to it, or linked one virtual network to it. And it's already got SOA record already running as part of that setup. Now, all I'm going to do is scroll down the side on the blade and look first at my virtual link or virtual network link. I can see that link was established, the link is completed, and I can use any resources within that virtual network to be linked on DNS records. In my records, currently, I don't have any entry of a resource type. Now, as we did before for the DNS zones, we do something similar in here. We can go and create a naming convention. Let's assume we are going to create a web server, and we'll call it, or we created a web server before. Let's just call it app server for now, and we'll say app server and leave it as that. So it'll be appserver.fabricam.net. Let's just leave it all lower caps for now, and appserver.fabricam.net. Now, what I would need to do is need to type in the IP address of that resource type so I can make an entry for that resource. Now, let's assume this is my 10.7 network.0 subnet AZ-104, the very first resource type that's available. Remember, the first few IP addresses in the network range are not available. As we mentioned in the virtual network session, the very first IP address that gets available for me is .4 in that range. So I'll choose that. This is the only resource in that virtual network. So we'll hit add. And this is where I have an entry made for that. Now, as and when I try to connect to that resource, again, this is where it will allow me to use just the naming convention for app server.fabricam.net, which should resolve into that IP address, which in the backend is a web server that we've got running in our environment. Now, a very quick conversation about the auto registration. So if I want to go and add any further resources, let's create another link. Let's call this my backend server link to DNS. Again, that's the naming convention that I can come up with. By all means, you can choose better ones, better naming convention than I do. And we are going to start choosing a virtual network in here, and I'll call out for VNet B. Now, I have one resource running in this at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable auto registration. As I mentioned, this will automatically create records for me. So let's have a look on how that looks like in this setup. Now, while we are here, let's jump on to my records. Remember, we created an A record for app server, and we have an SOA record already created. As and when this connection gets completed for the auto registration for the second setup, we should see an entry here for the resources that live in that new virtual network that we are linking to this private DNS. Now let's just quickly check the connection. It seems like the connection is up and running. Let's go back into the records and let's give the auto registration a few seconds to see if it'll pop up in here. All right, as you can see, that entry is now automatically made for us, and you can see there's a resource that I've called front end server 2, and that's the entry that I have, even though I called it a backend entry, but that's the name of the virtual machine, so I don't get to choose one. It's automatically registered for me. Now it tells me that in here that is it auto registered? Yes, the one that we've just created, this was automatically created. I didn't go and add this entry manually. As a result of auto registration enabled onto that VNet, it's created that for me. Now, if I go and have a look at some of the details, again, a part of that is automatically created me based on the name of the virtual machine. So my virtual machine is actually called front end server 2, has created me the rest of the path on that .fabricam.net. So if your naming conventions are different, like VM1, VM10, VM12, it will create the link for you as VM12.fabricam.net. So it's probably advisable to create better naming conventions for your virtual machines as well in your environment. All right, now this brings us to the end of this part of the session. Thank you for participating in Administer Virtual Network module. We have covered essential topics related to managing virtual networks in Microsoft Azure. We have learned how to configure virtual networks, network security groups, and Azure DNS. Remember to review the reference modules and check your knowledge questions on Microsoft Learn using aka.ms/learn to reinforce your learning. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.